Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, 40 herders are reportedly killed in a bomb blast in central Nigeria that some locals blame on the Nigerian military, but it denies that any Air Force plane was in the area at the time. We hear from our correspondent in the country. Also, Africa is less secure than it was a decade ago, with a marked deterioration in the rule of law. But there is progress in the empowerment of women. We hear from some of those behind a top report on the state of African governance. And several people lose their lives and over a dozen are missing in Madagascar in the wake of tropical cyclone Cheneso. The extreme weather has displaced tens of thousands and raised the risk of landslides. But first, the death toll from the bombing of herders in central Nigeria has risen to 40. Representatives of the victims in the village of Rukubi have accused a Nigerian military jet of targeting the community on the border between Nasarawa and Benue states on Wednesday. But the military denies that a plane was in the area at the time. Our Samuel Okoye tells us more.
The victims of the area attack are mainly cattle herders. They were loading their cows onto trucks when the missile struck them. The police in Nasarawa State, where the attack occurred, say they're investigating the incident. Raham Nansel, police spokesman in the state, said it is unclear if the missile that killed the victims was fired by an airplane or by a drone. The victims have been given mass burial, and some reports suggest that up to 50 people died from the incident. Questions remain as to who carried out the attack. Suspicion easily falls on the Nigerian military, as it is the only one known to have the capacity to carry out such an attack. But the military says it will not comment on the incident. The military has been carrying out extensive airstrikes in Nigeria's far north and the central part of the country as part of its war against jihadist groups like Boko Haram and armed groups known locally as bandits. People in the operational areas say the military has a history of hitting the wrong targets during some of its aerial attacks, causing high death tolls among civilians. When this happens, the military will either never comment or it will simply deny that any such thing happened. The military, however, accepted responsibility for an incident in January 2017 in Ran, Borno State, when the Air Force mistakenly bombed a camp for internally displaced persons. 115 civilians, including 6 aid workers, were killed during the aerial strike.
Sam Olukoya there for us. Now, the U.S. Treasury Secretary wrapped up a tour of Africa by saying that Washington would keep deepening its ties with the continent and that her country's interests were tied up with Africa's success. Her tour took her to Senegal, Zambia and South Africa, where she visited a Ford assembly plant on Thursday, where she restated her government's hopes of working more closely alongside Africa and pointed out the fragility of an interconnected global economy.
Over the past 3 years, we've seen how disruptions in one part of the world can shake the global economy. COVID-19 brought the world's economic activity to a standstill. Russia's brutal war against Ukraine has raised energy prices and exacerbated food insecurity. These shocks have taught us about the importance of secure and resilient supply chains. But the United States strategy toward Africa is centered around a simple recognition that Africa will shape the future of the global economy.
So we heard there about some of the stresses that the continent has been facing. And even with the courting of Africa from the world's top economies, a new report on African governance says that the continent is going through challenging times and is less safe, secure and democratic than a decade ago. Now, that's partly because of a rise in coups and conflict on the continent itself, but the knock-on effects of world events like the pandemic, climate change and the war in Ukraine have also taken their toll. told, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation considered the state of Africa in 2021 and has ranked Mauritius and the Seychelles as the top examples of governance, and Eritrea and South Sudan have been placed at the bottom. Well, for a closer look at the findings, I'm joined now by Pascal Lamif, who is from the foundation. Pascal, thanks so much for making time to speak to us. So, first of all, give us a bit of a sense of what the big takeaways are from the study, both in terms of good news and the more challenging.
Indeed, we have good news and less good news with this new publication of the Mo Ibrahim Index. That is a tool that allows to assess whether governance in Africa is moving on the plus or on the minus side. Now, on the good news, and this edition of the Mo Ibrahim Index is on a 10-year basis. The good news is that overall, there has been some progress during these 10 years in African governance. The less good news is that whereas these progress were pretty clear for the sort of 6 or 7 years of this decade, for the last 3 years, this progress has stalled. And this is a real worry because there is a sort of disconnect between improvements which we see in economic and social opportunities on the one side, and a degradation or a stalling in many countries on human rights, democracy, participation in public life. And this disconnection is a worrying thing for the future because we still believe at the Mo Ibrahim Foundation that economic and political progress have to go hand in hand.
Now, also in the report, the stresses caused specifically by climate change and the war in Ukraine were mentioned. Just tell us a little bit more about how those have had an impact on governance on the continent.
That's a very good point. The reality, and it shouldn't be surprising, is that Africa is not isolated from the rest of the world. Africa is globalizing. There are positive aspects in that, but there are also more negative aspects. This index does not really take into account the impact of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, because the last numbers are on 2021. That is 1 year before it happened. But if you take climate change, for instance, it's already clear that climate change has a negative impact on the governance in Africa, not least because of the impact it has in some regions where the lack of water, the rise of the temperature, create problems that leave a larger scope to be utilized, for instance, by terrorism. So Africa is already impacted by climate change, and this has an impact on governance overall. This is bad news. We know that, and this shows that if there is a place where we all need to make sure that the impact of climate change is mitigated and that the necessary adaptation takes place, it's Africa.
Message that can't be repeated enough, I imagine. And also, so you've called for reinforced commitment to strengthening governance in Africa. So what does that mean? What would that take?
Well, it would take constitutions to be respected. It would take corruption to be fought where there is still corruption. It would take less coup, whereas we feel an increase of coup. In other words, the rule of law, transparency, clean public life, an independent court system, we believe is the way to grow the economy. And given the demographics of Africa, it's absolutely necessary to grow the economies. And in order for the economy to grow more rapidly, we have to reconnect economic growth and better governance in Africa.
Thank you so much, Pascal Lamy there, speaking to us from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation just after the release of its latest good governance index. Now, at least 7 people have been killed and 13 are missing after tropical cyclone Cheneso hit Madagascar this week. Thousands have been displaced and have seen their homes and communities devastated. Meteorologists are also worried that there is still an elevated risk of flooding and landslides. Caroline Lamberley has more.
Roads damaged by landslides and torrential rains. Days after Cyclone Cheneso hit Madagascar, the island's people are still picking up the pieces. Thousands have been displaced. Many of them have been set up in temporary shelters, like this one at a public primary school in the city of Mahajanga.
We came because our homes were destroyed by strong hurricane winds. In my case, the house started to cave in, so I ran away. It was totally destroyed.
We are asking for help, especially for people like us. We have nothing. We don't have enough work to support ourselves, and many of us are single mothers. Many of us are sick or elderly.
The shelter started taking people in on Sunday, several days after the cyclone made landfall. It's now weekend, but it's still wreaking havoc. On the other side of the island, several inhabitants said poor infrastructure was to blame.
Everything is flooded here. We have asked the state to improve the draining of floodwater so that in case of rain it can flow away. Right now, we're living in misery.
The water should flow into the sea, but there is no drainage, especially in the irrigation canals below. They are blocked, and as a result, the water enters our homes.
The country is no stranger to inclement weather. Last year, it was hit by 2 cyclones and several tropical storms in the span of just 1 month.
And Egypt has unveiled a haul of new archaeological discoveries. The dozens of items, including 2 ancient tombs, date back to the 5th and 6th dynasties of the Old Kingdom. They were unearthed during a year-long excavation beneath an ancient stone enclosure within Saqqara necropolis at Egypt's ancient capital of Memphis.
Found are actually the statues that we found, because Saqqara revealed many statues in the last century. When you go to the Cairo Museum today, you'll find out actually how Saqqara gave Cairo Museum lots of statues of kings and individuals are shown in a beautiful way.
Absolutely stunning. Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Revisiting the fight of Rute, the president of the Association of Peruvian Women subjected to forced sterilization in the 90s.
We've been fighting for more than 25 years, and we will continue until we get the truth, justice, and compensation.
She listens.
These are the results of all the medical exams I've had, because I've not been well since my tubes were tied.
She supports.
We need to be respected, because you're not alone.
And above all, she does not give up.
Now is the time to apologize.
Watch Rute and her quest for justice in Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.